as I said, Leo and I go way back, but what some of you may not know is that he got his doctorate at the University of California at Riverside, is that right? Professor of history at Dixie State in St. George. Do they still have the Rebel, or did they get rid of the Rebel?
They got rid of it.
Got rid of the Rebel mascot.
They got a buffalo.
Okay. He's written many books and articles, far too numerous to mention tonight, but some of the books, besides the one that you came mainly to hear, Finally, Statehood, Utah Struggles 1849 to 1896, well known for having done the definitive book on San Bernardino, The Rise and Fall of a California Community. He did a tremendous biography of Amasa Mason Lyman. Did you just pick that out of the hat, that name, for some reason? And then, of course, he did the journals, edited the journals as well. Many articles in historical and periodicals. He's one of those historians that not only knows his subject, but well, I'll just put it this way: he's forgotten more than I'll ever learn about Mormon or Utah or Western history. But he's not one of those professors that scares you off and makes you dread having taken history. He's one that brings it alive. And he's always very, not only informative, but entertaining when he presents.
Voice, you'll understand
so
that.
I had the rare opportunity to quiz family members, which I don't usually get when we have a guest speaker. And let me just share a couple. The point was made that how good Leo is with names, that he remembers everybody's names and all these facts and so on. Maybe not quite as good on family members' names or events. One of his sons said they were going to go visit, I believe, their grandmother, and his son kind of put him on the spot and said, "I'm going to maybe embarrass you, but you're going to have to tell me what my full name is." Do you remember this?
I have a brother named Rick, and I get the two first names mixed up.
So, and then the other one I really liked, excuse me, was they were going to, I guess, stay in their daughter's home, and to get in, you had to put the code in on the opener of the garage. And she said, "Now this may cause a problem, Dad, but it's my birth date, and I'm not going to tell you what it is." So,
I got in.
and by all reports, they got in. So I don't think they were sleeping in the backyard, Ron.
I have to say something as impressive as Dixie State is. You know, he taught at Caltech and UC Riverside and where else?
Cal State San Bernardino and Cal Poly Pomona mainly.
Yeah.
You know, I've never actually had somebody raise their hand and add to my introduction.
He can do that. He was my editor.
Because they're so short as it is.
This is one of the grand poobahs of signature books. Anyway, thanks for that. I do have down. It was too. I couldn't say all those words. So I left that one out. One other to end this introduction. Another son who, well, one of them just said, "Just tell this one last." But there was another thing I didn't mention was Leo was a wrestling coach for a long time. I don't know how long, but you just look at him, you know you don't want to wrestle him, right? But there was a coach at the school where he was coaching, and he said that he was the greatest man he'd ever met. So I can't think of a finer compliment than that. He's certainly one of the finest I've ever met, too. So, Leo Lyman.
All of that. Thank you.
I think you're going to have to come around.
Thank you for coming. When University of Illinois Press remaindered Political Deliverance, Benchmark bought the old rejected copies that hadn't sold.
We don't call them rejects, we call them remainders.
Surplus.
And some people wonder, well, why the heck did you write one just like it 30 years later? That started with 1887, went to 1896, the last of the 7 attempts at statehood. This is the prequel that goes way before, and my editor once quipped in an email, "You've been working on this half a century." That's true. And I've added things since that. Insights, details, to what I got hooked on when I was in the 7th grade, Utah history. Just met my teacher's granddaughter in my ward. And I still honor that man. I wrote a page of my personal history on Sunday about him, about his influence on my life, getting me hooked on this subject that I've spent a whole life on as a hobby. Weird hobby to write term papers all your life. But that's basically it. Now, in those earlier 6 attempts at statehood, which are barely mentioned in there, the first one was way back in 1849. 2 years after Brigham Young and the First Saints came to stay in Great Salt Lake Valley. And it's almost an unknown story in Utah. I submitted the article to the Historical Society and they rejected it. It was too much California. It was called A State Larger Than Texas, combined California and Deseret as one state, and the proposer was Zachary Taylor, newly elected president of the United States. And he knew that slavery in the territories, the Wilmot Proviso, which never passed, but was like waving a red flag in front of a bull in the South, would divide the country if there wasn't a way to resolve it. He sent a guy named Thomas Butler King to California to whisper in the gold rusher's ear, write a constitution, become a state. It means you're self-governing. Now, the Mormons were a long ways from the minimum population of 60,000 needed for statehood. But Zachary Taylor says, hey, we'll add you to California till you get to 60,000. And that was a proposal made by the President of the United States. But it didn't get to Brigham Young until too late. He was trying to get the separate state of Deseret, that huge state bigger than Texas by itself. And it had just failed. By then, California had started writing a state constitution in September 49. And the letter didn't come from Brigham Young to California, where Amasa Lyman was collecting tithing in the gold fields. The most valuable gold field camp was Mormon Island on the American River. And they hadn't paid their tithing. Most of them had defied Brigham Young when they went to California to mine gold. Lyman, whom some liked better than they liked Brigham, were saving their money to pay the back tithing. And when it was finally collected, Brigham Young was able to start the first monetary system in Utah with the gold from that gold rush tithing collection. But by then, California had already written their constitution, and in the convention, there was no issue on slavery. It was rejected, even by the few Southerners. And the biggest issue was, what will be the eastern boundary? Will it be the Colorado Rockies? The old boundary of Alta California? And the opponent said, hey, if the Mormons wanted to be on our state, they'd have some delegates here. They didn't hear in time to get there until the Constitution was written. They came later, and it was too late. But the governor a guy named Burnett had been an attorney for the Mormons in Missouri. He knew them. He was now the governor of California, and he promised Lyman and some of the others, Joseph Smith's brother's wife's widow, Ina Culbreth's mother, Pickett, was one of them that was supposed to go and meet with the California legislature to get Deseret added. But Burnett whispered in a PS, hey, Deseret's as different from you, California, as Maine is from Texas. And that's all they needed to reject it. So the Mormons came that close to what I later called political deliverance. And that was a quote from the first presidency's telegram to one of the many lobbyists that I discuss in my books, legislative advocates for private issues, including political deliverance, which is independence of statehood. You're not controlled by Congress and appointed officials if you get statehood. Brigham Young and the Mormons recognized that was a great need very early, but they missed it. And they tried again in 1856-57, and that was terrible timing. That's the year the Republican Party was born, with the issues, the twin relics of barbarism, polygamy and slavery. And besides that, by then everybody knew that Brigham Young had a theocracy out in the Rocky Mountains. He was the boss. There was no democracy. There was no separation of church and state. And there was no love for any non-Mormon, Gentiles. And Congress had sent appointees out there. At first, President Polk agreed, hey, we'll let church members hold all those positions. And Alman Babbitt tried to get 4 of his friends appointed. And when Polk found out, he canceled the deal and said, okay, you can have half the 8 officials, but the non-Mormons will have the other half. And you know, they ran away very soon. And Brigham Young never could get along with any Gentiles, or especially politician Gentiles. And so, sending a constitution and a petition for statehood in 1857 was absolutely useless. In fact, the 2 guys he sent, I think John Taylor was one of them. I can't remember who the other one was, but they couldn't even find anybody to introduce it. So they had to just put it in the hopper, and it was never introduced. And that's an irony, because when Buchanan was elected, the delegate to Congress, Bernheisel, met with him, and there was no problem. The predecessor president, Millard Fillmore, hadn't had a problem with Brigham Young being governor. He wasn't going to reappoint him, but he was going to let him stay. He appointed another guy that turned it down, so Brigham was going to stay, until the officials in Utah started sending negative reports about what it was like for non-Mormons and apostates out in Deseret. And that's when Buchanan's order calling up the army to accompany a new governor coming to Deseret was formulated, a huge army really for the time, and came within a hair's breadth of a war. And there's been a myth in Utah for 100 years that Buchanan screwed up. Buchanan's blunder. Mormon historians blunder. That they didn't ever see the documentation that showed it was a justified move. William McKinnon, non-Mormon historian who worked on the Utah War for 50 years, while he was an executive, I think at General Motors, but it was his hobby, trained by Howard Lamar, the best Western history professor I've ever heard of. He has written 2 volumes that document how legitimate it was to send that army and to hold back on Utah statehood. Actually, I say in the book, and this is heresy to some up here, that Brigham alienated Congress so bad that they not only couldn't get statehood when he died in 1877, but it would take another 10 years till his enemies had died that were in Congress before they could even consider it. That's a kind of, you think my bishop will forgive me for saying that? I'm not going to tell him. He's already not sure about me. There was another attempt in 1872 that could have worked. By that time, George Buchanan, who's twice Brigham Young's father-in-law, was already assigned by his uncle, John Taylor, one of the apostles, and Brigham, to become one of the leading advocates for statehood in Washington, D.C., and he mastered those techniques. And some of the most important ones he learned, in my opinion, were from a young congressman from Nevada named Thomas Fitch, whose photograph is in the book, who had helped Nevada get statehood with less than half the population Utah had when they couldn't get it. The difference is Nevada was Republican. Abraham Lincoln, the first Republican president, was in office, and he needed 2 Senate votes from Nevada to help him ratify some amendments to the Constitution and maybe get reelected. And so George Buchanan is going to learn a lot from this Thomas Fitch. After he's not elected the next time, he's hired by the church as a lobbyist. And he goes to President Young and asks, hey, we can get you statehood. Congress will back you if you'll just make some concessions on plural marriage. Brigham didn't comment. He also asked one of Brigham's chief advisors, George A. Smith, and he may have said, well, let's give it a try, or something. It's not documented, but they went ahead. And for a year and a half, Cannon and Fitch and others are working with Congress on statehood. There comes a point, and this is one of the highlights of the book, the correspondence between George Buchanan and Brigham Young almost daily on what Cannon's doing to get statehood. And at one point, Cannon confides, they think we ought to give up our eternal salvation for statehood, meaning give up polygamy. That's how serious they are about it. And they're not going to do it. And finally, after sort of misleading Congress for a year and a half, George Buchanan appears before a House Committee on Statehood and admits, we do not want a constitutional amendment against slavery in the federal Constitution. And that seals not just that attempt at statehood, but the next one, which I say in there was a pipe dream to even try. I speculate it's just to help the Mormons keep a little hope that maybe sometime they'll get it. But finally in 1887, after Brigham Young's son John W. Young has cemented a very effective political machine, lobbyists, with the Democrats, Grover Cleveland, including the Solicitor General George A. Jenks writing a provision against polygamy for the new proposed Utah Constitution, and it's ratified by the voters, majority LDS. And they keep going through the next year. But finally, this is 10 years after Brigham's dead, John Taylor will die about that time, and he's been president for 4 or 5 years, and he's in hiding. And so were most of the other prominent church leaders, general and stake. And that's significant too. Not only didn't they get statehood, but with all of the polygamists in hiding because of the deputy's raid, anti-polygamy raid, there's nobody preaching plural marriage to the congregations. A whole new generation comes to maturity with no testimony of plural marriage. Now in 1882, Congress passed the Edmunds Act that said no person with more than one wife can vote or hold office or sit on a jury. But the non-polygamists, if they'll take a test oath, promising they won't aid and abet plural marriage, they can be full-fledged citizens. Now at the beginning, if you were ever a polygamist, you can't vote. But there's a Utah commission set up by that law. 4 Republicans at first, 1 Democrat, and then they get a second Democrat. And he happens to be a Civil War hero, John A. McClernand from Illinois. And the other one named Ambrose Bolivar Carleton from Indiana. They really make something of this test oath emancipation for non-polygamists who become the most active political majority. They've never had any power before. The church leaders have always made the decisions. Now, these younger non-polygamists will dominate from the middle of the 1880s on. And the other complication in that is that even some of the dedicated polygamists, when they're brought into court, deny that they will continue polygamy. Probably 20%. Jim Allen wrote an article called "The Good Guys versus the Good Guys" in the Historical Quarterly about some very prominent businessmen and civic leaders who decided to obey the law. It's probably 20% of maybe 60 cases decided in the late 1880s. It's never been publicized in Utah for good reasons, but the younger generation and some of the former polygamists are abandoning it. And the majority of non-polygamists is going to dominate from then on. It's going to be a whole different deal. Now, after that attempt in 1887, where they actually put it in the Constitution with Grover Cleveland backing, and I've got a lot of documentation about President Taylor saying, hey, we can't deny principle. And John W. Young says, you don't have to. The President of the United States is saying, just let your people ratify this Constitution and we'll let you go ahead with the process. They were doing that. But that all ground to a halt in 1890, the crucial year in both books, but more detail in the new one. There was a Supreme Court decision early in the year based on an Idaho case, Davis versus Beeson, where Justice of the Supreme Court, Stephen J. Field, who earlier had been a friend of George Buchanan's, when the Engelbrecht decision was made, the only decision I know of in that whole period that was in favor of the church, they were worried that the court had changed their mind before it was announced. Field met Cannon on the street and said, don't worry, he just hasn't got it written yet. Now, no Supreme Court judge should ever say that. This is one of the most prominent ones. And obviously, Cannon's got some respect, or this judge of the Supreme Court wouldn't say, relax. But he did. Fascinating story in the documents, but nobody's ever mentioned it before. The old heretic did. After that decision, there's no hope for the church. A congressman from Illinois named Shelby M. Cullom from Lincoln's old law firm wrote a bill to be introduced in the House and the Senate, the 𝘍𝘪𝘯𝘭𝘺 bill, that would apply that Idaho case to the whole country. It would literally take away not just the polygamous rights, but anybody that believed in the church. The right to vote, hold office, or sit on a jury. Would deny the right of the church to own property, to exist as a legal institution. It would wipe the church out if that law passed and was enforced. George Buchanan went back to Congress after trying with the Democrats his whole life to work with the Republicans. A faction of Republicans led by James G. Blaine, opposed to the worst enemy the church had since Boggs, Ulysses S. Grant, total anti-Mormon. Cannon sits down with James G. Blaine and his assistant, James A. Clarkson, Civil War general, editor of the same Iowa State Register that just endorsed Elizabeth Warren, even though it's a Republican paper this week. Anyway, the Republicans, at least the ones that are against all of the persecution of un-American people like Germans and Catholics and Mormons and people that want to drink beer on Sunday, the stalwarts are against all of those. And they've alienated so many Republicans that they've lost elections in places like Iowa. And so the Republicans are ready to make some changes. And one of the most important places to look, now that they've given up on the South, because there's not going to be Republicans down there until Nixon's time, they look to the West, where there are 6 or 7 new states coming, each with 2 U.S. senators. And they got 11 out of 12 before Utah. And the Republican Party started campaigning. Hey, the Mormons control the balance of power in 8 or 10 states. 2 of them were a lie. Iowa and Missouri, that's reorganized church members. They're not going to vote the way the Brigham Young's people want to vote. But the others may have the balance of power, even in Colorado and Arizona and Nevada. Certainly Utah and Idaho and Wyoming. And so it's a good strategy, and it works. But there's also a deal that says you've got to back up on polygamy. Not in September 1890, in June or July. The documentation exists in Abraham Buchanan's diary, right here, that when he went to New York for surgical attention for the residues of his typhoid fever, his dad showed him a document written by James G. Blaine through which he was an apostle at that time. They would concede that there would be no more contracting of polygamous marriages in the United States. And he was abhorred by the consideration, but obviously eventually signed it, as the others did. And Joseph F. Smith, who was in the first presidency, wrote to one of his good friends and said, we've had to make that concession to survive. Later he wrote to one of his plural wives in hiding in Nephi saying, Woodruff's going to make an announcement, this is September, but it doesn't affect us. We've already done what we're supposed to. We've contracted the marriages. It's those that put off the marriages that are in trouble. They're not going to get to do it. Serves them right for procrastinating. When the apostles met after the announcement, a press release called the Manifesto, Lyman, Francis M. Lyman, and John Henry Smith, a couple guys my size who were second cousins, and the most active Republicans outside the first presidency, most of the rest of the brethren were still Democrats. They said, quoted in both Heber J. Grant's diary and this Abram Cannon's diary, doesn't affect us. We're going to keep having children by our plural wives, as we're supposed to, as if nothing had changed. But it had for the church. At least the church members believed that, and they really started through the process of statehood. I've given more details on lobbying and the process of overcoming the opposition of Republicans like Orville Platt, who didn't think they'd given up, and he's got good reason. His son's Yale College roommate was Fred T. Du Bois from Idaho, who knew there was still plural marriage being practiced in Utah. But the lobbyists, Isaac Trumbull, who hadn't been heard of till I started digging on that. Gus Larson once wrote me a letter saying, I'm glad I at least mentioned him in my book, because nobody else had. And he really felt relieved that before the guy was really publicized, he'd at least mentioned him. And that was a great compliment to me as one of my professors that helped get me started on this and convinced me that Leonard Arrington wasn't some kind of an anti-Mormon. He said, maybe Great Basin Kingdom's not rah, rah, rah on every page like most Mormon history, but he's in stake presidency. That was a real shock to a young returned missionary. And he became my hero, along with Abram Cannon and Neil Maxwell, whom I spoke to a group today about. Anyway, there was a tremendous change in the year 1890, at least in public perception. And over the next couple years, all of the obstacles went away and political deliverance was accomplished. And it was the first presidency who thanked Isaac Trumbull for that. That's where the statement for the title of that old book, Political Deliverance, came from. Independence from government control. But in the epilogue of this book, it talks about, whoops, sometimes they had their fingers crossed. On plural marriage, in 1894, still a year and a half before statehood, Francis M. Lyman out in Grantsville, in a quarterly conference address, said, men will not achieve the highest degree of the celestial kingdom without performing the works of Abraham, which is plural marriage. And soon after that, Wilford Woodruff said, if we can't do that, we can at least reinstitute concubinage from the Old Testament. Righteous seed who will be sealed to us later. George Q. Cannon had just lost a son, David H. Cannon, on his mission in Germany, without marriage, without children. He went to his faithful son, Abraham, in the preface of the diary. I talk about this, and apparently talked him into courting David's and his cousin, Anne Mousley Cannon, Angus's daughter, who had dated David, and now she's married to Abram, but she never gets pregnant. And within a year and a half or so, I say, and some of the canons disagree, but you can do the reading and see what you think, he then courted David's last fiancée before his mission, Lillian Hamlin. And he did marry her off the coast of Long Beach on a boat where Joseph F. Smith was allegedly a passenger, but he never admitted he did that. Abram Cannon got sick on that trip from the old typhoid problems he'd had all his life. He died 9 months later, about the time Lillian had a daughter that she named Marba, Abraham spelled backwards. And if you look carefully at the church records, I think you can find where Marba was sealed to David H. Cannon and Lillian, who later married another cousin and was a teacher at what became BYU, I think, later on. Interesting life. But they've kind of violated some of the promises they've made on plural marriage. And about the same time, just after statehood, it became clear, mainly through a president of what became Utah State, a guy named President Kerr, tried to get a bill through the state legislature, funding bill, that Governor Heber Wells vetoed. And he couldn't get the veto overridden, at least the church leaders, led by a Deseret News editor named Charles W. Penrose, who was in the stake presidency. Later he'll be in the first presidency. But Penrose was sort of the ringleader of a committee of 4 or 5 apostles and Salt Lake stake leaders that scrutinize every bill proposed and decide which ones are going to pass and which ones aren't. And President Kerr and some others defied that, got that veto overridden, and publicized the existence of this committee. The committee actually disappeared in 1896 or so. And there were state legislators that Penrose had talked to that said, you can't tell me what to do in my vote. I've promised my constituents I'm not going to listen to you, brethren, direct politics anymore. There wasn't much of that for 3 or 4 years. And then, after a former territorial law that was really tough on polygamy had been codified into the state law, and they let it sit until about 1901. And then a stake president from Lehigh named Evans proposed a bill that was really lenient on prosecution of plural marriage. And there was pressure on Heber M. Wells, whose dad was a polygamist, his brother-in-law Heber J. Grant was a polygamist, and his brother Junius Wells was in the Council of 70, and he had more than one wife. But Heber M. Wells vetoed that law and committed political suicide. He'd have been one of the next U.S. senators. Frank Cannon's already screwed up. Arthur Brown, the other one's about to screw up. But Wells was never heard of again in Utah history because he'd committed political suicide by vetoing that law, blocking the easing of plural marriage. He said it was a really tough decision, but he made it. Reed Smoot became the senator instead of Heber Wells. For 30 years, arch conservative. What that epilogue says is that although some of the church leaders wanted to go back to polygamy and back to dominating politics, their own people wouldn't let them. The non-polygamists stopped both of them in their tracks. They didn't all live happily ever after. There was the Smoot hearings that caught Joseph F. Smith having more children after the manifesto. But by that time, he's ready to keep his promise. And 2 of the most fervent advocates, F.M. Lyman and Heber J. Grant, Lyman was his mentor, they've each lost 2 wives, so they're no longer polygamists. They become opponents of more post-manifesto marriages. George Buchanan never does, but he doesn't live very long. It doesn't go away for 2 generations. Some of you know some people that were at BYU and other places that had more than one wife a few years ago. But the beginning of the end was coming, and I've known of general authorities who are kind of embarrassed about the whole polygamous scene. Anyway, it's a fascinating story, and I've documented some parts that people haven't wanted to touch because it just wasn't done. Leonard Arrington once gave me a compliment. He said I could tell a negative story in a positive way as good as anybody he knew. I'd just written about Moses Thatcher, an apostle who was popular, who had his personality split by morphine, wasn't against the law. He had a stomach ulcer, tremendous pain. But sometimes he was submissive to the prophet and sometimes he was defiant. And enough of the other brethren had seen him defiant that finally in conference, and the same thing happened to John W. Young, they just weren't sustained. Enough people were against them that they were released by the congregations in general conference. Nobody ever kicked Moses Thatcher out, they just didn't sustain him. Sad story. But the church is human. And some people need to admit that. I've talked long enough. I want to hear some questions. Please, thank you. Yes?
How did we get the boundaries, and when were they set in place, and, well, that's the question.
Congress never liked Deseret. And finally, some of the religious political figures in the church realized they were never going to get it with that name or that size. There had even been proposals that Utah be compartmentalized and added to Colorado, Wyoming, and Nevada. Cannon blocked that, and it's not in any history book. But I know he did. The Nevada Senator, William M. Stewart, tried to get that to happen. Cannon stopped it and told Brigham Young it wasn't going to happen. It was just a more realistic size that was the only way they were going to get statehood.
So all the time they were trying to get statehood, were they working on that shape and that size?
They called it Deseret and kept the boundaries the first 3 times. After that, they were more realistic. About the time Brigham's gone, then that won't be an obstacle anymore. Yes?
So I knew about the bribes before, but not that it went through the railroad lobbyists. That was really interesting.
That's my baby.
And the volume was...
And that's in political deliverance as well. The church came to a point where they realized that the Pacific railroads had tremendous power behind the scenes in Congress. There's a quote by Abraham Cannon about the anti-Mormons have a huge horizontal machine that can block things. But he said, we have a vertical machine that goes really deep in a few places. And I think he's talking about lobbyists. They actually, in just over a year, and it cost $174,000 of subsidizing newspapers, changed the public image in the only media of the day, which was the national newspaper press. I've actually gone through about 10 newspapers and shown the anti-Mormon columns and editorials in the Chicago Times, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Louisville Courier-Journal, 4 San Francisco newspapers, 5 New York ones. It took me a couple years. These kids never saw their dad after 10 o'clock at night when I lived in Riverside. I think I was Elders Quorum president. I was doing my job and teaching, but I'd go over to the university for 4 hours at night and crank through that microfilm. For 1887, they're anti-Mormon statements. By 1888, they're positive. Now, a couple of Mormon leaders named Rudger Clausen and Seymour B. Young screwed it up, and the lobby fell apart. But the newspapers never reverted back. They stayed positive enough after that that they could achieve statehood because the public image had totally changed. Now that's an interesting story, and it's kind of uninspiring to say the brethren condoned some bribery. There's another case where George Q. Cannon wrote a letter to Daniel H. Wells. Brigham was down in his winter home in St. George, so he had nothing to do with it. George Q. Cannon asked Wells, is it okay if I use about $60,000 with people that one of the Walker brother bankers, mine owners, have bribed against statehood to try and smooth that over with $60,000? I don't think it was ever followed through on. President Cannon said, hey, maybe none of you can read Hawaiian, but Joseph F. Smith was on a mission there, as a mission in Hawaii as a teenager. He can translate this letter. I never found the letter. I just saw the reference to it, but it asked for permission for bribery, but I don't think it ever happened in that case, but it happened subsidizing newspapers. So good question. Important subject. And people like Greg Prince have been very complimentary that this old detective could do us a thing like that, which took more time than anybody's willing to spend, even writing a book, going through all those newspapers. But I enjoyed it. It's a weird hobby. Linda, my partner on a book.
Let's see, Nevada, Colorado, and,
They didn't have as many people as Utah.
yeah, okay, but they were states before.
Way before.
And
Colorado's 1876. Nevada's about 1864. And Utah's not till 1896.
And was Idaho before or after?
Yes, Idaho's before also. So's Wyoming.
Well, so that-
So are both Dakotas. So's Montana. So's Washington
Yeah,
State.
What I'm getting at is that they then formed the shape of the state because they got it.
Yeah, they already have cut Utah down to its later size. That's correct. Good observation. Other questions? You bosses say when it's time to quit. Yes, Gary.
So between the time of political deliverance and now finally statehood, that was like 30 years?
25 probably.
Were there any surprises?
Yes.
For you in finally statehood?
I didn't know all the details of Davis versus Beeson. How serious that was for threatening to wipe out the church. I don't think that's ever really been stressed. Maybe you can tell me. But if you look at constitutional law, it really squeezed us up against the wall. We had no room to wiggle. So there were, in every chapter, new insights that I add to the new book that are not in political deliverance. But that was brand new. Leonard said I can see anything he can. Every chapter is brand new stuff. I wrote my master's thesis on Wells without any sources, except newspapers. A. Will Lund was looking over my shoulder. Did he ever do that to you? I went in there one day and went home and said, I'm never going back there. 4 or 5 years later, Leonard called me on the phone in Riverside, California. He says, I got $2,000 if you want a fellowship for this summer. And before long, he was whispering to me I could see anything he could see. Now, it's not that way now. I signed a book last night to Ron Watt, who was a rookie archivist. And in what I wrote to him, I said, thanks for showing me some treasures that nobody had ever seen. Because those documents were brand new, open. And I was the first one that got to use it. It's been a long experience. I've seen the church go from sugar-coated history to honest, objective in the mainstream. And Kurt and others have seen that too. It's a tribute to a whole generation of crusaders. Some of you are here. Any others? I think we talked long enough, boss. Thank you.